Hey, I'm Adam Heimlich, CEO of Chalice Custom Algorithms, and this is Chalice's Antitrust Primer. Now, I am not a lawyer or an economist. My expertise comes from working for 1 year with lawyers and economists on an antitrust investigation. At the end of that, I found myself one of the more knowledgeable people about antitrust in Adtech, the field I work in, advertising technology. And then some people who are curious about the case against Google asked me to record a little primer for them. So this is especially for ad tech people, though, of course, anyone who wants a primer on antitrust from an ad tech point of view might enjoy it. All right, so with the caveat that this is going to be a crash course, and we try to get it into 30 minutes, and there's a lot of legal and economic information in it, though I'm not a legal or economist. So that said, we are going to start very far back, all the way in the Civil War, and talk about a Civil War general named William Tecumseh Sherman. Now, Sherman wrote one of the best firsthand accounts of the Civil War, which is his memoir, and he wrote about the events leading up to and his famous March to the Sea. So Sherman's March to the Sea was a very unusual military move where Sherman, who had just finished taking the Mississippi away from the Confederates, decided to leave his supply lines on the Mississippi and the northern railroads, and instead of chasing the Confederate army all over the South, march his whole army through the South, sort of horizontally, tearing up the Southern Railroad all the way so that they couldn't feed their supply lines. And then through that, they took Atlanta, they took Savannah all the way at the sea, and it was a big factor in the Union winning the Civil War. And when you read Sherman's book, you realize that this was someone who had great resolve, was very practical, and very clear-eyed about the fact that the Confederacy, including their leaders, who Sherman knew from West Point, down to the poor Southern whites, had convinced themselves that their authority should override the authority of the U.S. government. And Sherman was one of the first to see that just can't be, that it must not be, and that someone was going to have to go down south and convince them through force that the American authority would hold sway. So the strategic importance of railroads really pops out when you read his memoir. The whole time they're tearing up this railroad, it was actually easy to put railroads back together. So they started heating up the rails over fire and then wrapping them around a tree. There's still some of these left in the South. They're called Sherman's neckties to this day. So without the railroad, the Confederacy couldn't fight. So Sherman was very aware of the strategic importance of railroads. In the period after the Civil War, the owners of the railroads become so powerful. And I'll draw an analogy. I'm not going to say that they were like the Confederates, that they seceded from the Union, but they certainly felt like they were not subjects of the United States, and that in many ways they had more power than the United States. And it was actually Sherman's younger brother, John Sherman, senator, who wrote the antitrust law that's still in act today, and it's the law under which Google is charged here in 2024. So that's called the Sherman Antitrust Act. It's passed in 1890, and it's really short. You could read it in a couple of minutes. It says it's illegal to monopolize or attempt to monopolize a market, and that it's illegal to stifle competition and abuse monopoly power through any means, right? So this law, the Sherman Act of 1890, gives the U.S. government, this is the Department of Justice, and later the FTC is founded, the weapon they need to fight these entities, now the railroads and soon to be also oil companies and sugar companies, who had become more powerful than the United States government. So John Sherman, like William Tecumseh Sherman, just had a very practical, clear-eyed approach to dealing with entities that thought they didn't have to listen to the U.S. government, right? You often hear when people are challenging liberal democracies, they say, oh, they don't have the resolve. And, if you push on them, they'll give up and they don't want to sacrifice or fight. Well, both Shermans are counter examples of that. Great fighters for the cause of the authority of liberal democracy. So in the early 20th century, there's a heyday of trust breaking, as they called it, the progressive era. And there are some really big antitrust wins, including the breakups of Standard Oil and General Electric. And then in 1914, you get the US's other antitrust law, the Clayton Act, which take care of a few things that probably should have been taken care of in the Sherman Act, but weren't. This is US oversight over mergers and acquisitions and tactics of price discrimination, right? Charging some people one thing and other people another thing. So that sets the terms of antitrust for the rest of the 20th century, all the way until 1978. And in 1978, there's a sea change that's caused largely by one man, more broadly, the school that he taught at, which was University of Chicago. So his way of thinking, and his name was Bork. Bork's way of thinking is referred to as the Chicago School of Antitrust. And Bork's book is called The Antitrust Paradox. The paradox he was talking about is that big companies, very big companies, can bring great efficiency to the economy, especially their way to make prices low and to achieve economies of scale, right? It gets cheaper to produce and deliver a good, the bigger that you get. So in contrast to the Sherman Act outlawing monopoly, under the Chicago School, monopoly isn't necessarily bad. And being a very big company or being the biggest in a company, even dominating a market, being the biggest in a market by far, is not necessarily bad. And the antitrust paradox introduces what becomes the standard for the rest of the 20th century and into the 21st for deciding if a monopoly is bad enough to take action against. And that's called the consumer welfare standard. And the consumer welfare standard basically says prices are going up. If the monopoly is causing consumer prices to go up and consumers are harmed by higher prices or lower quality for the same price, which is kind of the same as prices going up, then it's a monopoly that action should be taken against. So from 1978 all the way until recent times is a golden age of American consolidation and of big company power. So I think most of us are familiar with this. There's been an enormous amount of mergers in all of our lifetimes: airlines, insurance companies, banks, telecom providers, right? There's been much less monopoly action, and this is largely because the consumer welfare standard. To prove a case under the consumer welfare standard, what's generally needed is, loosely speaking, a market definition and a theory of harm. So the market definition is to take care of what would be the Chicago School's objection to a monopoly is if they're raising prices, but you can buy a substitute thing, right, that's part of the same market, then the monopoly is not bad. So you define a market by substitutes, right? If there are substitutes for this thing in the market, then it's not a bad monopoly. So it becomes important for the prosecutors of antitrust to define the market with borders around it, around the thing that the alleged monopolist dominates. So in the case of Google, right, the case is about publisher-side ad tech, technology that runs auctions and monetizes websites, right? There may be a lot of ways to monetize websites. The question is whether the auction method of monetizing websites is a market in itself. Right. And on the buy side, if there was a buy side case, and there's not, I'll get to that. The question would be, is programmatic advertising its own market, or is search a substitute for advertising, as advertisers are concerned? Is TikTok a substitute for programmatic display and video? So most of us who know these markets ourselves, it's relatively easy for us to say, no, those aren't substitutes. Like if money moves over to TikTok from programmatic, like papers have to be signed and it goes to a different team. So that's not the same market. That's not a substitute, which would mean that budgets flow freely from above. It's not considered going to another market. You don't have to sign a different contract and work with a different team to spend in that. But Google is going to spend as much time as they can, in their case, arguing about the market definition. And the other half of this is the theory of harm. So the theory of harm could be, yes, prices are going up. Here's a chart that shows prices are going up. Or the theory of harm could be the quality is getting lower. So this idea that the theory of harm could have to do with prices getting lower is what carries the day for the prosecution in US versus Microsoft. So that case is originally brought in 1998. Microsoft loses and then wins on appeal and ends up settling that case over 3 years But it's pretty important to understand the market definition and theory of harm in US versus Microsoft. To think about US versus Microsoft, you have to remember a little bit about the state of the internet in the late 90s, right? There was just the beginning of browsers and competition among browsers. And one of the things that sparked the case was that Microsoft, which had a very large market share, the DOJ said a monopoly on operating systems, was making it hard for the Netflix browser to operate. Microsoft had their own browser, what was it called? Internet Explorer, and Internet Explorer had special access to Windows, which made it work. So there's something that's outlawed under, I believe, the Clayton Act called an illegal tie. A tie is if when you buy one product, you have to buy another. Which was the case with when you bought the Microsoft operating system with your new computer. You also bought Internet Explorer, so they were tied, and you can't use a tie to move your dominance from one market to another. So DOJ was saying Microsoft was tying its dominance in operating systems to achieve dominance in browsers. The market was the market for browsers and other internet applications. And the theory of harm was barrier to entry, which is a bit of a bank shot in that barriers to entry don't necessarily make prices higher or quality lower, but you could see how they would, right? And it's usually thought that the DOJ's case in Microsoft was vindicated by that when Microsoft settled, and the settlement required them to open and share the APIs into Windows so that any internet application could work without being blocked by Microsoft. You have an explosion of internet innovation, and Google and Amazon come out of this period as these enormous and successful companies rivaling Microsoft, some say as a result of this barrier to entry being removed around 2001. So the next big thing that happens in antitrust is just kind of a lot of pent-up energy over the intensity of mergers and the consolidation of market power in many, many sectors, but very little done about it after US versus Microsoft. And then in 2017, a Yale law student named Lina Khan writes a paper called Amazon's Antitrust Paradox. So the title is referring to Bork's 1978 antitrust paradox. What Khan argues in Amazon's antitrust paradox is that the Chicago school way of looking at consumer prices isn't really good enough. That a company, and giving Amazon as an example, could operate at a loss, right? They could be funded by venture capital and operate at a loss to make everything super, super cheap until all the competition goes out of business and then raise prices, right? So it's a strong argument, though it was derided by proponents of the Chicago school as hipster antitrust, right? This school is also sometimes called the Neo-Brandeisians after Louis Brandeis. But Kahn's paper sparks a lot more activity around the big tech monopolies and how they might be attacked, right? How they might be confronted by regulators. Lina Khan ends up appointed by Biden to lead the FTC, and another neo-Brandeisian lawyer named Jonathan Cantor ends up the head of the antitrust division of DOJ. He had a history of taking on big tech in civil suits. So it's taken as a signal that the Biden administration's approach to tech antitrust was going to be very different than had been taken the previous 21st century presidents. And that is borne out to be true. All right. So in the Biden era, you get two cases against Google. They're both called US versus Google. So they're usually called the search case and the Adtech case. And the search case is just ending. We're not talking about that today. And the Adtech case is scheduled to start in September, although depositions have already started. So people are already testifying in this trial. It's on. There's rumors that there might be a settlement. Google certainly has reason to avoid a protracted trial. There's a lot of embarrassing allegations in the complaint. And I advise anyone watching this with an interest to read the complaint. We might have a separate session on the complaint if people like this one. We could go through all the conducts and what they mean and how I think they'll be explained in court, especially if the case is settled. It might be worth spending time on the complaint. Not entirely clear from the complaint is whether Jonathan Kantor's DOJ intends to try to prove the case in terms of market definition and theory of harm in line with the consumer welfare standard and the last 50 years of antitrust precedent, or if he's going to try something else. What we do know for sure by Google's responses to the news and by their proxies in the media is they're going to try to stick to that 50 years of precedent at the Chicago school as closely as possible and talk as little about the conducts as they can and the most that they can about the market definition and theory of harm. So we already saw this in the search case, where Google says there's all kinds of competition in advertising. And we have to worry about TikTok coming in from China. We have to worry about OpenAI creating a tool that can replace search. And all of these are in our market. As far as we're concerned, the revenue we make could be substituted by these things. So this is the same market and easy substitutes for what we do. And if it comes to an argument about that, the government will have to argue that the ad tech market, specifically monetization tech, ad servers, and exchanges, constitute a market. As for theory of harm, Google has already put out a lot of information, claims that prices have gone down, and it's possible the DOJ will have to try to skewer them. One way, if you look overall at ad prices and say, browser ads have come down, you could easily point out that more and more browser ads are served on mobile, they're smaller and they're cheaper, and they're going to bring the average cost down, and that's not an apples to apples comparison. So Google wants as much of that type of arguing as possible about market definition and theory of harm. That's their best chance to win. Now, what DOJ did to minimize the chances of Google winning that way was ask for a jury trial. Now, DOJ can only ask for a jury trial if the U.S. government is a plaintiff in the case. But the U.S. government is a big advertiser and publisher, including the U.S. Army, the Department of Health. So they did make claims on behalf of U.S. agencies so that DOJ could ask for, and they were granted a jury trial. The last thing that happened as I record this in May of 2024 is Google just presented a check to the government to cover the damages by those federal departments that were mentioned in the case, so they could negate DOJ's claim to be a plaintiff as well as a prosecutor in the case. And they didn't just pay the damages, they paid triple damages, which is the antitrust penalty in the worst cases, and for some reason, those are called treble damages. They say treble instead of triple. So Google paid those treble damages, and if it's accepted by the judge, it will switch from a jury trial that DOJ wants to a bench trial where the judge decides, and where an argument that's focused on market definition and theory of harm is bound to get a better hearing than the case DOJ wants to make, which is basically going to be like, you ripped off publishers who just wanted fair auctions on their sites, and you didn't run fair auctions, and you took money away from everyone's local newspaper and favorite entertainment site, It's going to get a lot more sympathy from a jury with that kind of story people can relate to than a story about economic terms like market definition and theory of harm. So if there comes to an argument about that, DOJ is going to say, Google is only paying this money cynically because they know they committed these crimes. They know they're guilty, and by paying the money, they're admitting guilt, and they just think it's the best way for them to get away with it. You'd think that argument would be very strong, but I'm told that in legal circles, it's considered okay and normal to pay a settlement and maintain that you didn't do it. Now, the thing that I'll suggest you watch, the thing that I'll be watching if this comes to trial, or if there's any other developments become public as we go to trial, will be more evidence of barriers to entry and of barriers to innovation, barriers to entry to the market, to the ad tech market, and harm as seen as a reduction in quality in the ad tech market. The best clue we have to what kind of argument the government will make about that, and it's a big clue, is a paper called Platform Annexation, which is by two economist professors, Susan Athey of Stanford and Fiona Scott Morton of Yale. Now, both of those have done some work with regulators, and in fact, Susan Athey is now working for DOJ, presumably on this Google case. She's the like the chief economist of DOJ. So that's why I say this paper is a pretty big clue to what the theory of harm would be. So platform annexation is just a few pages long and available for everyone to read, but I'll summarize by saying it's kind of similar to what was argued in US versus Microsoft, which is that, they have all this power. Microsoft has all this power in operating systems, and they're trying to use that dominance in that market to block development in the adjacent market of web applications, right? Like they're sitting in the middle of the market playing referee, and they're throwing out anyone who they don't like or who is a threat to them. And what platform annexation argues is that a platform, and she doesn't specify Google, they don't specify Google, they say that a platform could create barriers to multi-homing. And what they mean by multi-homing is really clearly described through the metaphor of Lyft and Uber. Lyft and Uber, compete because if you want a car and you go to Uber and there's a long wait or the price is too high, you could just flip over and you could just click the next app on your phone and go to Lyft. So that's multi-homing. And taxi drivers too, the drivers are also multi-homing. So they're on the sell side of the market. They could take rides from Uber or Lyft. So she says that's how it's supposed to work with platforms, two-sided platforms, they call it, like Uber and Lyft. They have a buy side and a sell side, that everyone is multi-homing, and that keeps prices from getting too high, prevents abuses of power. And what they argue is it's possible for a platform to prevent multi-homing by taking over adjacent markets. And if you watch Google closely over the last 20 years, you could imagine how this case might be built, how Google spread from its dominance in search to a dominant ad server, a dominant ad network, a dominant exchange, dominant measurement platforms and web analytics, right? And that makes it very hard for a buyer to multi-home, which we all know as using multiple DSPs or moving budget from one network to another. And on the sell side, from switching the monetization tech and taking demand from different sources, right? People will tell you that it's hard to multi-home and that there are significant barriers to multi-homing for customers of Google's auction technology, which is said to have something like a 90% market share. So in that, and by the very fact that DOJ decided to bring a case about publisher tech instead of buy-side tech, right, where it's going to be easier to argue that prices have gone up instead of down, right? So if Google says that they've driven prices down for advertisers, that's almost the same as saying they've driven prices up for publishers, right? Because if advertiser prices are going down, publishers are in some cases making less money, but at the same time, Google's tech costs the same. So it's easier for DOJ to argue that this is extraction. The consumers under the consumer welfare standard are publishers, and that works for as consumers. They serve consumers and are consumers of Google's products, that it's their prices who have effectively gone up as their quality has gone down because of this barrier to multi-homing. So that's the argument as it's kind of set up. But right now it's really a turf war over the narrative that will carry the trial and maybe make it out to the public, that I think is very confusing if you're watching. Is this a story about publishers being ripped off and the ad tech stuff markets that we know every day? Or is this something about arcane economic concepts of what's substitutable in what market and what passes muster as a theory of harm according to the last 50 years of judges judging antitrust cases? So to bring it back to the Civil War, if you are of a mind like Sherman and you're saying big tech thinks that they can get away with anything and that they have more power than the US government, then a way to be practical and to have resolve and to arm yourself with weapons is to understand what Google's doing when they try to make the conversation about market definition and theory of harm, and to advance the simpler narrative, barriers to innovation, illegal ties, and platform annexation, and barriers to multi-homing. If you can read that paper and understand it, we can only do our best. So that's it. That's where it stands today. As I said, I'll do more on the complaint itself and maybe something on what I was talking about when I spoke to the Senate in 2020 about some of these issues. I could clarify some of that if people are interested. Let me know. I'm Adam at Chalice AI. You can find me on LinkedIn. Thanks a lot for asking me to do this. I found it fun and hope to see you all soon.